Hi, I'm Lars and this is my land. In my land, I get to do pretty much whatever I want. And today I want to talk about how I became obsessed with the Beatles in just 2 months. Today is June 14th, and as evidenced by this text, I became a Beatles fan 2 months ago today. See, something I like to do every few months, maybe a few times a year, is just go look up some Beatles music videos. It's kind of the same thing as some of the videos I watch over and over again. I can't explain it, but I like to do it. But this year, I somehow, for the first time, noticed that Paul McCartney was left-handed. And then I just kept watching more and more videos. And then I got on the Spotify, and then I started watching interviews. I just spiraled from there. Now I can safely say that I know more about the Beatles than most people. Chances are, if you're watching this, you probably know quite a bit about the Beatles. But do you have a Beatles shirt? Probably. Have you watched all of these documentaries? Maybe. Do you have 6 Beatles bookmarks? This one's holding my place. Do you have these Beatle books and then another one in the mail? Good God. I also have this, but I'd had it before. My partner gave it to me because somebody gave it to him. It doesn't matter. I have never been an ephemera or merchandise person. I do not give a shit. And yet here we are. So let's talk about how one band can change someone's life like this. Now that I'm editing this, I realize that this video is not that. So what I should have said is I'm going to talk about the Beatles for the next 20 minutes because I'm enthralled with them. Now that I realize all of the things that I left out, I definitely plan to make more Beatles videos in the future. But in the meantime, enjoy this video, The Ramblings of a Madman. Welcome to Annoying Memos Land. Beep, 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 beep. Were you wondering about this beautiful conspiracy board behind me? This is just a glimpse into my upcoming video essay series on the TV show Lost. Conspiracy boards are a lot harder than they look. I'm working on this thing for 6 months. It's gonna be awesome or something. I would love it if you like and subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Content warning. I have the loudest chair in the universe, driest eyes in the country, and that TV mount tends to just fall to one side. I just wanted to get ahead of this and apologize in advance because all 3 of these things will interrupt all of my videos all of the time. I'm just going to give some thoughts on the Beatles. When I was watching the Get Back documentary, and if you haven't, it's on Disney Plus. It's about 6 hours and it's really interesting. The Get Back documentary showed the weeks during which the Beatles recorded the Let It Be album and then their final performance on the rooftop of the Apple Studios or Apple Corps, whatever, it doesn't matter. Most people say that that was the end of the Beatles, even though they went on to work together for about 6 more months. During that documentary, something that really reeled me into their personalities was how the Beatles wanted to be the Beatles. This guy, Michael Lindsay Hogg, was the one directing the documentary, and he seems like a real crap person just because of some of the things he said.
Theater. Because I could see it outside, torchlit. 2,000 Arabs and friends around.
But I have to give him credit where credit's due because this thing is shot super well. There's lots of really neat cinematic shots. I really enjoy it. It was interesting while all of these people were giving this input on where the Beatles should have this new concert. Should they have it in this huge amphitheater? Should they do it on a TV special? The actual Beatles were giving out ideas like this. Paul said, we should trespass. We should go into the Houses of Parliament and be playing while the cops are taking us out. And another one was maybe we can just play in this park and just people will come up to us. As a general rule, the Beatles just wanted to be the Beatles. It was watching a bunch of people pull these 4 guys in different directions where they were all pretty resolute on what they wanted. Even though they were continuously bothered about leaving the country, Ringo said that he didn't want to go, and that was the end of it. Ringo didn't want to go, it was over. Watching the documentary was mesmerizing, just seeing how these guys interact with each other, knowing that it is living history because the Beatles did change the world. They changed the way that music was produced, released, made. Before this, most pop and rock artists would just do covers and they would release that, and anyone coming from Liverpool or Britain, they would change their name. They would defect to some sort of American type accent. They would usually have a front man and like side men. It was never a band of 4 more or less equals. And they start writing their own songs, and their own songs are really catchy. They've got 4 very talented musicians here, and it's just very unlike everyone else. And of course there was Beatlemania, and that is intense. From 1963-ish to 1966, these guys were touring the world nonstop, and when they weren't touring, they were making their next record, they were making their next single. It was completely nonstop. I can't imagine a greater experience to bring 4 people together. What they have all said, that they're like family. You know, families fight and they make up and they have problems and they love each other no matter what. I don't know how I didn't get into the Beatles before this. My favorite type of music is mostly Motown and classic pop. How did I not get into the Beatles? Don't know. Before April 14th, this was my most listened to song of the year. I mean, seriously, some of these songs are such a bop. Okay, for real. How did I not like the Beatles before this? I knew the songs that I liked. I liked Come Together. I liked Hey Jude. I liked Something was my favorite Beatles song. Now I don't have a favorite Beatles song. I didn't even know who sang what. And I did know John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
I'm warning you with peace and love, but I have too much to do. So no more fan mail.
But I didn't know whose voice was whose. I've listened through most of the Beatles discography on Spotify. I'm working my way through it. The music is so diverse that I can't find myself getting bored, whether it be from their opening classic pop phase to their experimental phase to their end phase. I think everyone could find something to enjoy in their hundreds of songs, 213 songs precisely. Just because I think if I were watching this video, I would be kind of bummed if I didn't address this. I believe the Beatles. I take what they say at their face value because I have no business trying to speculate on what someone's emotions were when they said things. Yeah, so I'm not gonna put in this interview footage. I have sincerely, this sounds so like braggarty, but I've watched too many and I don't know which all of them are. So if you want to learn more about these interviews, I guess just look them up. The Beatles breakup was rough and these guys love each other. In fact, they called their breakup a divorce. And no matter what, throughout the time that they were all feuding, they all still maintained that they loved each other and that they were always connected. That's something that humanizes them to me. And you know what really humanized John Lennon to me?
Early in the morning, you know, I'm not 18.
That. We've all been there, John. I'm just going to speed run through their version of events. This is by no means any sort of comprehensive list. And if there are some facts wrong, let it be. Just leave me alone. In 1966, touring had become so unenjoyable for the Beatles that they had to stop. They couldn't hear themselves while they were performing. They were being escorted around in a bulletproof van and no one was happy. After that, the band was able to spend more time in the studio working on more and more complex music. Things got a little spicy with McCartney and Lennon. There seemed to be a lot of issues with songwriting credits. I don't know how much of it is a pride thing or a money thing, but these guys had a lot of possessiveness over their songs. Paul McCartney is a known perfectionist, and while they were making the White Album, he took over and insisted on doing things like the drums. He was doing all of the parts. Eventually, Ringo felt so left out that he left the band. He tried to have some conversations with John and Paul, and he was so frustrated with their answers that he went on vacation. Then the group reached out to him, please come back. We miss you so much. And when they got back, they had a nice little reception. So things were kind of rocky in 1967 to begin with. The more famous falling out is the one that's captured in Get Back with Paul and George. Paul is just really nitpicking George. He starts kind of going in on one of George's songs. John winds up kind of mocking that song, and even if he's kind of doing it in a tongue-in-cheek way, it was not the right time for that. George starts getting a little defensive, and then a few days later, they're all working on another song, and during this time, Paul just keeps nagging him. He just keeps pushing. You can tell that these guys have this shorthand. They're speaking in a way that's almost hard for the audience to follow. They seem to be on their own radio channel. We can put together the pieces, but I'm not entirely sure what they were saying. Eventually, George got so frustrated that he was just ready to leave, and he said, I'm leaving the band. John says, when? And George says, now. So they kind of deal with that. There was a confrontational meeting. and then there was another meeting. In between that, we heard a recording of a private conversation between Paul and John, kind of owning up to some stuff.
It's a pestering wound, and yesterday we allowed it to go even deeper, but we didn't give him anything to do. And when he is that far in, we have egos.
At the end of that conversation, kind of gives you chills. Paul McCartney said,
We're all very old. We're all reading each other. I think we're all singing together.
that sucks that they never got to see that happen. I can't talk about this without talking about Yoko Ono. There's a lot of contention surrounding her, and I think that it's important that I just mentioned that I think some of that hatred is based in sexism and racism. Click off if you want. I have to say that. If I'm believing the Beatles, then I'm also believing Yoko, giving her the benefit of the doubt that I think anyone deserves. And when I listen to her interviews, she has some interesting things to say, and if I take it at face value, sometimes I really like what she had to say. I think that everyone deserves that sort of chance, and it's kind of snobby to say, hey, you broke up this band 50 years ago, so you forever. Come on. Essentially, John started bringing Yoko into the studio while they were recording. Previously, that was kind of a no-no, and partners only came into the studio during very special occasions, like when everyone knew that they would be there. Essentially, the two of them just wanted to be close together, but Yoko's presence made everybody kind of nervous, and it became a moment of tension between the band. I think that there were plenty of wedges in between the Beatles at this point, and maybe Yoko was the one driving it. Not that she was driving it, but her presence was driving it. I don't think Yoko was purposely trying to break up the Beatles. I think the Beatles were done. They were already saying this stuff.
And I want a decision. Maybe we should have a divorce. Well, I said that at the last meeting.
And of course, the presence of Alan Klein, we can't forget about him. He was signed up to manage the Beatles. Paul disagreed, and for the first time, not all four Beatles signed something. Klein represented John, George, and Ringo. Eastman, Linda McCartney's family, represented Paul. So he wasn't stuck in those contracts. Well, it turned out that Paul's reservations were correct and Alan Klein is a crook. He really screwed over the Beatles, and they wound up in lawsuits for the next several years. They wound up suing each other when Paul needed to get out of the Beatles contract. They wound up suing each other when George didn't like the way that Ringo did music. It was kind of a rough decade. For the most part, Ringo and Paul made up with John, and George did not have a chance to do that. There was some contention over something that George wrote in his book, and John didn't like that so much that he stopped talking to George. They didn't have a chance to smooth it over before John died. Here's the point where I am going to speculate. I believe they would have made up. I believe that all of the Beatles would have made up. I do not believe that the Beatles would have reunited, done a reunion tour, any of that. Unless if it were for some sort of charitable cause. Perhaps if they were all alive right now, they would have done something for the war in Ukraine. I know that Julian Lennon sung Imagine for the first time in public once Ukraine was invaded. Maybe that would be something that the Beatles would help with. They went through so much stuff in such little time, and people tend to forget that they got together when they were teens. Paul met John when he was 14, joined his band when he was 15. George met John when he was 13. He already knew Paul and joined the band when he was 14. These guys have been together since the jump, and it makes sense that they got sick of each other. All of them at different times had frustrated interviews. All of them at different times had loving interviews. It seemed like the one who had the most trouble with the past with the Beatles was George, and it's probably because he got the short end of the stick a lot of times, from what I understand. For people who are very talented, who are aware of that talent, they're flawed, and they weren't always good to each other. As far as the aftermath goes, at the end of the day, there was an interview where George spoke about how he loves John, and he also spoke about how he loves Paul. John did an interview about the Beatles and about Paul. He called Paul his best friend even then. Ringo is generally amazing, and I'm not positive that he's not just sunshine disguised as a human. Have you seen them in the same room? In one of the documentaries I watched, Philip Norman said that Paul rewrites history, but if you go back and watch all of the interviews from the 70s and the 80s, they're still the same as they are in 2015, where Paul said that John and Yoko just wanted to be together and that was okay, and that the Beatles were going to drift apart and that was okay, and that it all hurt. but he still loved all of them, and that was okay. I don't see how that's rewriting history. I think everyone should believe the Beatles. They're the four guys who went through this, and maybe it's worth just taking what they said at face value. The way that they have interviewed over the course of the years, they're either speaking in jest or they're speaking in earnest. And of course, through all that time, they're making petty songs back and forth at each other. Of course, they're kind of going through all this stuff and they're saying shit about each other behind each other's backs. But one of the biggest arguments of theirs was on camera, and they didn't really even raise voices. I love the Beatles' activism. I knew that they were very invested in peace. I wasn't aware of how interested they were in all types of activism. I thought that that was great. I generally love the passion of the Beatles, the band, and the Beatles, the world. The fans of the Beatles are insane. Some of the Beatlemania stuff just blows my mind, just because it would be so different now than it was then. One thing I really hated though was when the fans swarmed Ringo as he was leaving the Dakota, like the day that John Lennon got shot or the day after. It's just, leave him alone. Just, this is not the time for that. I love the passion. It seems like they are timeless. Even though the baby boomers really grew up with the Beatles, every generation after this has continued to enjoy and love and support the Beatles. And that's really neat. It is truly like living history. You see the impact that the Beatles have had on the history of Britain, on the history of the world, and the future of pop and rock music. My final thought, I just love the Beatles, and I'm happy to be part of the fandom. P.S. Fuck a favorite Beatle. You can't have a favorite Beatle. My favorite Beatle is the Beatles, okay? Jesus. I don't know why I'm so mad about that. I guess I forgot to mention some of my favorite Beatles songs. I don't have favorites, but the ones that I've been listening to a lot recently include I Me Mine, Sgt. Pepper in general, Strawberry Fields, Within You, Without You, Oh Darling, Two of Us, We Can Work It Out, She's Leaving Home, Blue Jay Way, Help. I love Help, Dig a Pony. Some of these songs I didn't even know were Beatles songs. Like, I knew these songs, but I had no idea that Dig a Pony was a Beatles song. Thanks for visiting Lars Land. Please like and subscribe and get ready for my Lost videos, because those are gonna be insane. Bye.
This is a serious message. Peace and love. Peace and love.